Welcome to this course of Marvelous Designer, everyone. First, I'm going to go over the overall settings of Marvelous. So at the top, you have settings and preferences. First, I'm going to start off in settings and go to user settings. So shortcuts are obviously what all the shortcuts are for your keyboard commands. So you can change them here, edit them here, see what they are. Pretty straightforward. Next is graphic options. This is usually a pop-up dialog that opens up when you first open up Marvelous. I have it disabled right now, but you could change the settings here. Depending on what your computer can handle, you adjust the settings here. If you need shaders on or off, if you need the shadows on and off, the shadows might hurt your computer performance, so you might want to turn those off. Anti-aliasing, I almost always leave on 2 times. You could move it up 4 times if you'd like, but I don't notice that much of a difference. As long as I leave it on 2 times, I'm happy. So for view controls, you have user presets over here. So this is what Marvelous Designer is set to by default. If you select here, you can change it to Maya preset, so you have the Maya controls for navigating around, or 3D Studio Max. You also have a couple others that you could adjust to. Default files are where the files get saved to locally. If you need to change the directory, you could change them here if you'd like. And other than that, they have the others category, which is all the other settings. The particle distance is at 20 by default. You could change it lower if you'd like. You have the mesh option, which is by default is set to triangles. You can change the quad now. I always leave it on triangle. It's not a big deal. Sometimes I'll change the quad at the very end. You can do that afterwards on the fly in Marvelous as you create your fabric. Units you could change from inch, centimeters, millimeters. I always left it on millimeters because that's the default. Maya is usually default by centimeters. You could change to whatever you prefer. I never change any of viewpoint options or the gizmo options. So next I'm going to go over the overall UI. So on the left side you have the 3D view with the avatar in it. On the right side you have the pattern view or the 2D view or the UV view. Whichever you prefer to call it is up to you. On the far right you have 2 menus. The property editor and then you have the object browser. The object browser will have a scene which shows everything in the scene and you can control it here. Anything created will be placed into here. I almost never go into the scene view, so it's not that big of a concern. Fabric is where you create new fabrics, delete fabrics, and apply new fabrics. The property editor, basically if you select on anything, you have options for that fabric. All the options will be covered here. If you go into a different mode, you could have different options also. On the top right, you have the simulation, which is by default. You also have animation. You'll go to animation at the very end of this course, which we'll talk about animating the folds. But right now, always leave it in simulation. In the 3D view, by default, you could zoom in, zoom out by holding Alt and left clicking. You could right click to rotate. Middle mouse button to pan. Middle mouse scrolling will zoom in and out also. The view controls are basically the same in the 2D view. Middle mouse will pan, middle mouse will zoom in and zoom out, and that's all you need. So if you select something in the 3D view, you have the gizmo. By default, it's set to screen coordinates. Personally, I always go into preference, gizmo, and I change the local coordinate or world coordinate. Screen coordinate I never use and I don't like it. Your preference, change if you like, but I almost always change the local coordinates and then it's saved as default for me as local coordinates now. First, I'm going to go over the 2D view, the UV view options, all the options on the top right. If you right click, you'll have all the options here if something is hidden or not hidden. So you can turn them on, turn them off. The first option is basically the selection option, so you can select fabric. This will let you manipulate vertex points as just clicking them and you can just drag. Next option is a transform pattern. If you click on that one, this will let you manipulate it by scale or rotation. Rotation is above everything on the separate dot. So if you click on this, you could rotate. If you hold shift, it'll snap to 45-degree angles. If you go to an edge, it'll work on scale. If you go to the middle point, it'll scale on that axis. Next is all the curve options, or this one, which will add a point on the map, a vertex, onto an existing fabric. The first one is edit curve. This will add one curve onto it and you control it between the 2 points. After you add it, if you go to the next option, you can manipulate it from here. This option is better just because you could add multiple curves on it. So if you want to add another one, you just click on here and click another one. It'll add 2. To delete them, you could right click and delete. This third option is adding the black dots, so you can add multiple on at once. You could also right click on it and you could change it by ratio. If you want it perfectly in the middle, you could change to 50%. Or if you want uniform split, you could change how many dots get added on that edge. Edit round corner option is the 4th option up on these. This will curve an edge. If you want a soft edge around something, it will soften it up. Next 3 options are the basic polygon options to create the fabric. The middle one creates a rectangle, the far right one creates a circle, the far left one, you create it by clicking. As you hold shift, you can make straight lines, straight 45-degree angles, but you could add as many points as you want. Click at the end to finish it. Personally, I always start off with a rectangle or a circle. Next three options are the internal lines. Basically the same as the polygon options. You have the one where you can just click points, make them how you want. Next one is a rectangle, and the last option is a circle. Mostly I use the first option. Zoom in on the mesh. You could create these internal lines anywhere. These can be used for selecting in the 3D view, rotating on that internal line. It could be used to add a point on the mesh to sew into. It could also be used as a point to add details in the mesh to create bumps in the mesh or patterns like pleated or designs in the mesh. We'll go over this in the following classes, so just know it's there and it's very useful. Next option, we have the darting option. This option will cut a hole in the mesh, so if you want it to pinch in so it's a little bit more form fit on the avatar. For an example, I'll zoom in. I could add a dart here, which will be a hole, and then you'll stitch this in. And if you simulate it, it'll pinch it in, so it's a lot tighter in that area. It's a great way to add a hole in the mesh too. Besides using a dart, you could use the internal line. So a circle or the square or draw it out. If you use the circle option, you could put a hole in the mesh by creating it, double clicking it, and you could right click on this and you could cut. This will add a cut into the mesh. The option to the right of the dart is called the trace. The option to the right of dart is trace. I never used it yet, so I'm not going to go over that. The next two options are edit UVs. So the one, we'll turn it on so you can see the box that'll be drawn in when you export it into your other software. The option next to it will just show the UV view, so you can move stuff around and edit it. The first option will let you adjust it, so you could scale it and move it around. Never had a point to use the edit UV options. They're there. If you find a use for them, awesome, but as of now, I never use them. So the next four options are the sewing options. The first one will edit the sewing lines that you have on your mesh. So if you need to delete a sewing or reverse a sewing, that's the option you'll select. So if I zoom in, I could go onto a seam. You'll see the dotted lines where it connects from and to. You could right click. You could delete sewing. It'll remove that sewing. I undid that. You could right click. You could reverse it, which will make this incorrect. As you can tell, it's incorrect. You don't want the seams to go one side to one side. So basically you're sewing this side into here and this right side into the left side. So you don't want that. If I simulate it, it's going to do a weird pinch because it doesn't know how to sew it well. So let me reverse that back and I'll simulate it back on. So let me delete that. So the next option is the sewing option. This option is the basic sewing. So you can sew anything into any other point. Right now, the sewing option only works with the original points you added, the little vertex dots. Right here you have 3 dots. It'll only stitch in this area into this area. It can't split in the middle. It could only go from one point to another point. That's when you would use the free stitching. So with the free stitching, you would select the area you want to start with. So I know there's a point here, and the middle point is here. I want to start with one of the points. It has the length already set for me. So as I click the starting area and the ending point, it has 80 and it remembers that. So if I click on the starting point I want, it'll create a blue dot. And that basically is the exact same length as the previous one. You could click anywhere you want, so you don't have to snap to that dot, but it creates it for you to make it precise. So on these options, you'll see a little triangle on the bottom right of some of these. On the 2D view, it's only on 2 of these. If you click on the sewing one, if you click and hold, you'll get 2 options. So you'll have segment sewing, which is the one I went over with, and you have 1-2 in segment sewing. So let me select that one. Let me delete all these. So I'm deleting the stitching that's already on there. So if I use the 1-2 in segment sewing, all I have to do is select this area. And as I select, I can select all 3 areas and I can hit enter and I'll stitch it in. It's kind of like free stitching, but a little different. Let me switch that back and delete these again. And it will be one segment, one stitching segment instead of several that you have to delete. The next one is if I hold here, the free sewing also has 1 to end. So if I select the start and the end, I can select the start, end, then click this area and this area. And then hit enter, and it'll stitch it in also. There's just a little bit more options to handle. They're a little bit quicker to do. I never used those yet. You guys can choose your preference, whichever one you are more comfortable with, use. The next 3 options are editing a texture that is placed on here. Right now you can see a very vague texture placed on here, so it has red stripes. Let me just change the texture to something more visible. As I select the first option, you can see it on here. This one will let you move it around and rotate. The next option will let you load up a fabric on there. The next option shows the texture or does not show the texture. Let me put that back. That will cover everything in the 2D view. So there's your options. Mostly you'll use the manipulating one, the adding the point on the mesh, and creating a fabric pattern. The internal lines are very useful also. The sewing will be another tool that you'll use a lot of the time. So now let me go over into 3D view. To start, we have all the options up here. The top left one is the simulate. It's also spacebar. It's the most used option in Marvelous because it's simulating the fabric onto your mesh. So if you hit space, it'll simulate it. Or you could just left click it up here and turn it off. The next option is your select move. This option is your main tool to use. You'll select on any fabric. If you shift click multiple ones, the gizmo will vanish. As you have them selected, you just have to left click again and you'll get the gizmo back wherever you click. If I click one, you can manipulate it on the axis. As long as you select something, you can slide it in and out. You can slide it up and down. And you can also rotate it. I don't want to cover the next two options in too much detail right now. So you have the green shirt and the pink shirt. The green shirt is select a mesh. I only use this option to create cuffs or collars. It'll help you reverse the fabric pattern. The pinning option will pin multiple pins at the same time and you can manipulate them all at once. First, to create any pin on the map without selecting this, as long as you're selecting on the basic tool, if you're in simulation mode, left click and hold, you can create a pin. It'll be this orange pin. You create as many of these as you want, and you could always delete them by, as long as you're still holding W or let go of W and re-click W, left click it, it'll delete the pins also. You could also create multiple pins. They're great for temporary holding stuff in place, fix errors, and anything like that. You could also select on this mesh, right click it, and you could go to pin and delete all pins. It'll delete all the pins on the mesh. If I go to the pink shirt option, this will create multiple pins. It's the best to select it in the 2D view in my opinion. And you can select a row easily. And if you go back here, if you're in simulation, you could slide it up on that. You could move all of them at once. Very useful. And if you select it, you can slide it on this axis. Right click, pin, delete all pins. Next is the fold arrangement option. So this internal line that I added before, if you use the fold arrangement option, you can select on it. And wherever you select, it'll put the gizmo. And you could rotate on that, which is really beneficial for collars. And you could use it for other things if you're creating a pillow or anything like that to help you sew stuff in a little bit quicker, a little bit cleaner. Also on these two shirt options, you could have a box select or a lasso select. Box select is just a rectangle and lasso is just a lasso instead of selecting it with a square. So the next three options will be your tacking. Let me start off with the middle tacking option. This tacking option will, as long as you click on one part of the fabric and another part of the fabric and you simulate it, it will tack those together. It'll pull those together temporarily or permanently, depending if you want to keep them or not. To delete these, you have to go to the first option, and then you right click on it and you hit delete. The third option is pinning the fabric to the avatar. So if I pin it to the avatar and then simulate it, it'll pull it up there. And same way to delete it, you go to the first option and delete it. The next two options are resetting stuff. So the first option will reset this to look like the 2D view. The next option will reset it to the initial way you set it up with arrangement points. So if I click that, you'll see how they selected on the arrangement points. I'll go over the arrangement points very shortly. The option to the right of it is play motion. When you add an animation into here, it'll play the animation of the avatar. The next three options, the measuring tools for the avatar. Let me go in here very quickly, hide the fabric. So the first option is edit measurement. The avatars that are created in here already have all their measurements already set on them. But if you want, you could create your own. The first option basically lets you select them. The next option is the circumference one. This one will actually let you create measurements. So if you select somewhere and select another one on, say, the bicep, left click twice, 2 points, you could just drag your mouse around and it'll create circumference around the arm. As you click it, it'll create it. So for now, it says 240. The arm circumference is 240 millimeters. It's useful if you want to get a vague idea how big a sleeve would be or a waist would be or neck. Whenever I create them, I usually delete them afterwards because they're just as reference. So right now, I just undid it. The next option is the basic tape measure. So you could go from the top of the arm to the bottom of the arm. Double click and you'll get the length of that, which is 506 millimeters. And I'll undo that. If you click and hold on this, you have three other options. The surface tape measure and a height measure. The height measurer, wherever you select on the mesh, it'll go to the ground plane. So it'll tell you how high you want something from, say, the waist to the plane. If you go to the first option, you could adjust this. So if you're doing a trench coat and you want to just go to the bottom of the calf, you could get the measurement this way. And right now, this is 765 millimeters. And the surface measuring tool, if you select it and select it, this one stays on the mesh. The other one just made a direct line not on the mesh. It'll hover off of it. Same with the circumference ones. Let me undo everything. The next two options are the edit texture, the same idea of the 2D view where you could rotate the texture on here and adjust it or add a new one. This option, press, will basically, if you have plants that you wanted pleated, you could select one part of the garment and another part of the garment. It'll make this more of a crease. If you simulate it, it's going to be very difficult to see, but this will be more of a crease than it was before. The next option are the piping options. This will help create piping. So if you want around the mesh on the internal lines or anywhere on any of the seams, you could click where to start and you just drag it out and double click to end it. And it'll create this little piping around it. If I simulate it, you'll see. That goes over all the functions in the 3D view. On the upper far left side of the 3D view, you have all the display options. The first one is the fabric options. The first one will hide or show a garment. The next one will show pressure points. This is where the contact is on the mesh. You don't see anything happening right now because it's already on there as best as it can. If I move this, you'll see the points move around. As they stop moving around, that basically says it's not going to simulate any further. The next option is show seam lines. Anywhere you have a seam in the mesh where it welds in, it'll display it or not display it if you have it selected on or off. Most of these settings I leave on. The option after that is internal lines, so you can see them on or off. Let me move this out. The option after that is the sewing. You could display it on or off. The next option is the pins. So if I turn that on or off, the pins will be displayed or not displayed. I never used the show button yet, so I'm not going to cover that. Just leave it on. Doesn't hurt to leave it on. The next option is show piping again. This will be the piping on or off. So you can see it showing on the upper left side of the shirt. The next one is the avatar. This will show all the other options for the avatar. So you could hide or show the avatar. This will show the arrangement points or not the arrangement point. If you create the arrangement points on the mesh, since this is a default in Marvelous Designer, they have the arrangement points set up for you. As long as you select on a fabric, you can select anywhere on these arrangement points and it'll snap to that area. We'll cover this in a later class. The next option is showing the bounding volumes for those arrangement points. The arrangement points are placed on top of those bounding volumes. That's basically how the fabric will lie on it as you click those. We'll cover this in a later class also. Just for now, just know the options are there. Next one is showing the joints. I never imported joints into Marvelous. I always animated before I import into Marvelous, but this will show the joints or not show the joints. And the final option is showing all the measurements that you have created or not created. The option under that will affect the fabric. Let me zoom in. So the first option is showing thickness or not thickness. As you can see, it'll put a little thickness on here. Let me select the mesh really quickly and change the thickness. As you can see, as I turn it on or off, you see a little thickness added onto here. This is just for viewing. I never export the mesh with thickness. I always export it as a thin mesh, and then I add the thickness in ZBrush or Maya afterwards. I prefer to view it usually with turned on. The next option is just showing it in a grayscale view with no texture, nothing applied to it. Next option shows as transparent or not transparent, so you can select it on or select it off. Next one is the wireframe. Basically, it comes in handy when you want to see how dense the mesh is. The final option is really useful. It's called the strain map. It basically shows where the pressure is being placed, where it's being most pulled. So right now, you can see all the pressure is put on the straps. If you pull it, you'll see it gets tight because that's where all the pressure is being pulled, and you let go, and it'll get softer. Green means it's very comfortable on there. Red means it's very tight. It's useful when you create something and you don't know something is too tight on the mesh. You could turn this view on and you can see it's tight and you can make it a little bit larger so it fits the body a little bit better. The other option with the thickness view, as you turn thickness view on and off, you'll notice the internal lines come on and go away. Basically, the thickness is created from the center of the mesh, so it's thickening out. The internal lines are drawn on the center line, so as you turn it on, you can't see those internal lines that well just because the thickness is covering it up. Make internal lines and you won't need to edit them or see them. It's always good to go to the thin view. And the final option here is another option for the avatar. It basically has a texture view, untextured view, and then the wireframe view. You have other options where you could right click on everything. So on the 3D view, let me cover that really quickly. You could right click here, you have all these options. You could deactivate pattern. Deactivate means the pattern's in there, it's still stitched in, but it will not simulate at all. Stuff could go in it and go around it, it's not going to affect it. Just right click it again and activate. You have freeze, the pattern is in there, fabric will hit it, collide with it, will not be messed with at all. So it's very useful a lot of the times. If you're creating layered fabric, it's very useful. Also, you'll notice when you freeze a fabric with piping, it does not freeze the piping. After freeze, the next option is strengthen. Strengthen is really useful if you're having a lot of mesh errors or anything and you want to just see the mesh for what it is. It will basically make it very tight and it'll push out any folds or any detail you had in there, but it'll keep it very tight. You'll see me use this in the following demonstrations constantly. It's useful, just know it's there. Then you have a quadrangulate and triangulate. By default, the mesh is triangulated. You can change it to quads, and it'll make quads as best as it can. You could use whichever one you want. I also showed you in settings, you could change it by default to be always quads or triangles, whichever you prefer. Next is flip normal. If you flip the normal, most of the time you'll notice that when the normal is facing the wrong direction, it's dark instead of the normal color. You don't want this. This will cause errors afterwards. You want the normal facing correctly when you're in a 3D software. So try to keep it correct. If you notice an error, you could always just click it and flip normal and it'll fix it. By default, whenever you create a fabric, the normal will always be facing forward and the back facing will be on the back side. Next options are these options, which we already covered on the top. Flip horizontal, it'll just flip the garment horizontally, and flip vertically, we'll flip it vertically. Reverse arrangement will reverse it on the same bounding volume arrangement point, but the stitching will stay where it is. Hide 3D patterns, show all 3D patterns. These are good shortcuts to know. Shift Q, Shift W. If you select a mesh, you can Shift Q and it'll hide it. The fabric is still there, but it's just hidden. And if you Shift W, it'll make all of it come back. That covers all those options. To go onto the fabric, you have your fabric up here. You could create a new fabric, or you could adjust the fabrics that are already created. If you add a new fabric, you have the name you could change here, which is easy enough to change. You just select it and just rename it. Rename the fabric to keep it nice and organized is very useful. This is where you could apply a texture onto your fabric. The color. Let me apply this fabric onto a mesh so you can see it as I edit it. So I just click on it and just click and drag. If you select all the mesh at once and you click and drag, it'll apply to everything you have selected. If I want to change the color, I can just go in here and just change the color. So if I wanted this a dark fabric on top. So I just renamed it to test so I know. The specular color is basically the shininess of the fabric. So if you higher it, you'll see it a little bit glossy. If you lower it, not. And if you add color, it'll add a color to it. And you can see it on there. Specular map, you could add a texture on there also. Emissive color is basically if it's going to glow or not. I never had a use for that. Opacity basically makes it transparent or not transparent. Pretty straightforward. Physical properties, this will cover over which fabric you want to apply. They have default ones set up here, and you could edit them on the details. I'll cover this later on in the course. As you select on the mesh here, you'll also get options. These are all the options for the fabric. This is where the elastic will come in. I'll cover this later on. You'll have curved side geometry, which so if you have thickness view on, if you select this piece, and if I put curved side on, it's basically softening off that so it's not a hard edge. Like I said before, I never exported with thickness. It's just for viewing in Marvelous. It's a nice feature to have. I don't really use it. Particle distance is the density of the mesh. So as I select the mesh, higher it is, less dense it is. Lower it is, more dense it is. That's why the scale matters a lot in Marvelous. So for this, if I change it to 50, it's a lot less dense. If I change it to 10, it's really dense. Layering, option to put layers on top of other layers and to say this hoodie is on top of this shirt and don't fight with it, don't have the shirt on top. So you could change it temporarily, say this hoodie is layer 1 and the shirt is layer 0 and the hoodie will be simulated on top of the shirt. Shrinkage, weft and warp, you don't have to worry about. This is the fabric. Stretching, weft is the horizontal and warp is the vertical. You don't have to worry about that. Leave those as default. You can mess with those settings if you want, but they are not needed. The thickness collision and the thickness rendering. Rendering is the thickness that you see in Marvelous. So higher this is, the thicker it will be displayed on the mesh. So higher this is, thicker it is rendered. Lower it is, lower it is. The collision, I leave these the same just because when I export it into ZBrush or Maya, when I make the thickness, I like to see how thick I want it in here. It is useful to see it just to get an idea of when I make the thickness in the other software. The collision is this collision in Marvelous when it collides with the mesh or the avatar. I prefer to leave those exactly the same. Pressure is adding pressure to it. So if it's like a balloon or a cushion, you could add a little bit of pressure to it. I'll cover this in a later course. The fabric that is applied to the one I have selected, it will show up here. The arrangement I'll cover in the arrangement options demonstration. And then finally you have miscellaneous. The miscellaneous will just show you the vertex count, the face count, and if it's a quad mesh or a triangular mesh. If you go to the sewing options and you select an edge, you'll get a couple more options on there. I'll cover this in the class too, but very quickly, you could activate the stitching or turn it off here. The sewing type, you have two options, flat or turn, and the fold angle and the fold strength. When you create an internal line, you have the option to create the fold strength and fold angle, but on the actual seam lines, you could also change it with this option. After I put the fabric back on as the default fabric, the test fabric is applied to nothing, so a little trash icon will show up saying it's not applied to anything, and you could always delete it, so keep your scene clean. When you save your scene, the fabrics will save within your scene. On the far bottom right, you have other options. Far left one is the one you're seeing right now, which is the split panel. 3D will just show 3D, and 2D will just show 3D. And the far right one will refresh everything. Other than that, there's some other options you could change at the menu. You'll have the basic file. This one will be overall creating a new fabric, opening a garment, adding a garment, saving, importing, exporting. This is your basic options. Then you have edit, which is your undo, redo, delete, and everything else. 3D garment, this is most of the options are already displayed with right clicking or anything other than that. I covered all that. 2D pattern, pretty much all these options are everything that you've seen on the right side here. Sewing, these are the same options here, but you can select them up here instead. Materials, the same thing where you could add fabric, remove a fabric, textures, graphics, and everything else. Avatar, up here in the avatar window, you'll have delete all avatars. That'll delete your avatar in the scene, avatar editor, and a few other options. The avatar editor, they give you a few varieties on avatars. You could have male or female, you could have a child, and you could have different hairstyles and shoes. Our industry, you're most likely going to have an avatar you've created in a different program that you're going to import in. The arrangement points I'm going to cover in another course, and the measurement options are all here, which you can see here. You could edit them here, delete them, and rearrange them there. Other than that, we have display, which is mostly everything we covered already, and we'd never covered wind controller. That'll add the wind in here where you could modify it, and the light controller so you can move the light around. You can show the frame rate and a few other options, but everything else we've already covered. But that covers pretty much the whole user interface in Marvelous. You could go back to this video as reference to see what tools you need to use, what tools are available. Feel free to just play around and get accustomed to Marvelous. We'll cover all these tools in the following class. So have fun, enjoy, and talk to you guys next time. Thanks, everyone.